Chapter 4. Khazars and Judaism, a long love affair. One of the few surviving testimonies left by the Khazars themselves, is the important document known to scholars as the Cambridge document. Its originality is less disputed than that of King Joseph's letter. This Hebrew manuscript, written by a Jewish Khazar from the court of King Joseph, was found in the famous Cairo Geniza, published in 1912, and has since been kept at the Cambridge University Library. Little is known about the writer or the addressee, but it appears to have been written in the 10th century CE and may have been another reply to Hasdai's request. The text is fragmented, and many words are missing, but it is still a rich source of information. After a few missing lines, the letter reads as follows. Armenia and our ancestors fled from them, for they could not bear the yoke of the worshippers of idols. And the princes of Khazaria received them, for the men of Khazaria were first without the Torah. And they too remained without Torah and scriptures and made marriage with the inhabitants of the land, and mingled with them. And they learned their deeds, and went out with them, to the war continually. And they became one people. Only upon the covenant of circumcision they relied. And some of them observed the Sabbath. And there was no king in the land of Khazaria. Only him who won victories in the battle, they would appoint over him them as general of the army. Now, it happened, at one time when the Jews went forth into the battle with them as was their wont, that on that day a Jew proved mighty with his sword and put to flight the enemies who came against Khazaria. Then the people of Khazaria appointed him over them as general of the army in accordance with their ancient custom. The document also describes a tripartite brainstorming encounter between a Muslim, a Christian and a Jew, similar in essentials to the description in King Joseph's letter, and concluded, of course, with the appropriate decision in favor of Judaism. It seems that this literary historical model was very popular in that period, because early Russian chronicles describe the conversion of Vladimir I of Kiev to Christianity in almost the same manner, though naturally with a different outcome. A contemporary Arab writer also described the Judaization of the king of Khazaria following an intense theological debate, except that in his text the Jewish scholar hired an assassin to poison the Muslim scholar before the decisive confrontation, and in that way the Jew turned the king to his religion and converted him. The rest of the so-called Cambridge document, like its opening, suggests an interesting hypothesis concerning the Judaization of the Khazars. Israel, together with the men of Khazaria, returned in perfect repentance. But also the Jews began to come from Baghdad, from Khorasan and from the land of Greece, and strengthened the hands of the men of the land, and encouraged themselves in the covenant of the father of the multitude, Abraham. And the men of the land appointed over them one of the wise men as judge. And they call his name in the tongue of Khazaria, Kagan. Therefore, the judges who arose after him are called by the name Kagan even unto this day. As to the great prince of Khazaria, they turned his name into Sabriel and thus made him king over them. It may be that this Sabriel was the post-conversion name of King Bulan, mentioned in Joseph's letter, and this story may well be unreliable, and the dramatic descriptions of the Judaization merely fables and sermons. However, stories about migration as the catalyst in the process of proselytization seem much more relevant to understanding Khazar history. The arrival of Jewish believers from Armenia, from today's Iraq, from Khorasan, which covered parts of modern-day Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan and Pakistan, and from Byzantium may well have triggered the conversion of that strange kingdom to Judaism. Proselytizing Jews were driven from the arena of rival monotheisms, Christianity or Islam, to the lands of paganism. As in other regions that witnessed mass Judaization, so in Khazaria, it began with immigrants who convinced the pagans that their faith was preferable. The great mass proselytizing campaign that began in the 2nd century BCE, with the rise of the Hasmonean kingdom, reached its climax in Khazaria in the 8th century CE. The Khazar Hebrew testimony about Jewish immigration finds support in Arabic literature. The Arab chronicler al-Masudi wrote, "As for the Jews, they are the king and his court and the Khazars his people." The Judaization of the king of the Khazars took place in the caliphate of Harun al-Rashid. Many Jews who had heard of it joined him from all the Muslim cities and from Byzantium. The reason being that the Byzantine king in our time, the year 332, 944 CE, Armanus, Romanos, forcibly Christianized the Jews in his kingdom. Upon which, many Jews fled from Byzantium to the land of the Khazars. The Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid lived from 763 to 809 CE. The putative Byzantine Emperor Romanus reigned in the first half of the 10th century. This passage suggests that the relation between the Khazar kingdom and Judaism developed in stages, the first of which was in the 8th century CE. We have seen that in that century the Khazar armies invaded Armenia, and even reached the city of Mosul in today's Kurdistan. In these regions there were still Jewish communities, people remaining from the ancient kingdom of Odia-Bene, who had spread deep into Armenia. Perhaps it was in this encounter that the Khazars were first exposed to the religion of Yahweh, and that some Jewish believers accompanied the army when it returned to Khazaria. It is also known that proselytized Jews bearing Greek names lived on the northern shores of the Black Sea, especially in the Crimea. Later some of them fled from the vicious persecutions of the Byzantine emperors. Yehudah Halevi noted in the Kuzari that the Khazars converted in 740 CE, but the date may not be correct. A Christian document written circa 864 CE in distant western France stated that all the Khazari obey the precepts of Judaism. At some stage between the mid-8th and mid-9th centuries, the Khazars adopted Jewish monotheism as their particular faith and rite. It is also reasonable to assume that this was not a miraculous single act, but a long process. Even King Joseph's questionable letter describes the conversion as occurring in stages. King Bulan was persuaded by the logic of the law of Moses and became a Jew, but only King Obadiah, his grandson or great-grandson, reformed the kingdom and set the law in the proper order, built synagogues and seminaries, and adopted the Mishnah and Talmud. It is also said that he invited Jewish sages from far away to bolster the true faith among his subjects. If in the 19th century scholars were doubtful about the conversion of the Khazar kingdom, today it is not in dispute. The spreading monotheism reached the Caucasus and the steppes of the Volga and the Don, today's southern Russia, and convinced rulers and tribal elites to believe in the many advantages of a single deity. The question remains, why did Khazaria opt for Judaism rather than the other monotheistic religions, with their less onerous requirements? If we set aside the magical sermon included in King Joseph's letter, the Cambridge document, and Yehudah Halevi's book, we are left with the same explanation that accounted for Himyar's conversion. The desire to remain independent in the face of mighty, grasping empires, in this case, the Orthodox Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Muslim Caliphate, impelled the rulers of Khazaria to adopt Judaism as a defensive ideological weapon. Had the Khazars adopted Islam, for example, they would have become the subjects of the Caliph. Had they remained pagan, they would have been marked for annihilation by the Muslims, who did not tolerate idolatry. Christianity, of course, would have subordinated them to the Eastern Empire for a long time. The slow and gradual transition from the ancient shamanism of the region to Jewish monotheism probably also contributed to the consolidation and centralization of the Khazar realm. One of the leading collectors of material about the Khazars was a Karaite Russian named Abram Furkovich. This tireless researcher was also very devout, anxious to create the impression that Khazaria had converted not to rabbinical Judaism but to Karaism. He added and deleted material in various documents, sacred books and tomb inscriptions. Thus, despite his valuable work of preservation, he damaged many sources and created general distrust. Eventually his falsifications were discovered by other scholars, chiefly the important historian Abraham Eliyahu Harkavi, and closer investigation revealed that the Khazars' Judaism was not at all Karaite. It is quite possible that Karaism, no less than Talmud Judaism, spread through the expanses of Khazaria, especially to the Crimea, but the Jewish practice in the kingdom was, to a greater or lesser extent, rabbinical. The historical consolidation of Karaism came too late to have been the first catalyst that prompted the Judaization of the Khazars, and there is no reason to assume that it went on to capture all of them. Moreover, at the time of the Khazar conversion, copies of the Talmud were still a rarity, which enabled many proselytes to take up ancient rites, even priestly sacrifices. Remains of a body found in a burial cave in Fangoria in the Crimea were found clothed in leather garments in the style worn by servers in the Jerusalem temple, as prescribed in detail in the Old Testament. But one of the wonders of the Eastern Jewish kingdom, for which it is still praised, was its religious pluralism, inherited from its early polytheistic shamanism, which was still popular in the region. As al-Masudi wrote, the laws of the Khazar capital decree 7 judges, 2 for the Muslims, 2 who judge in accordance with the Torah, for the Khazars, 2 who rule in accordance with the Gospels, for the Christians among them, and 1 for the Sakaliba, Bulgars, and Russians and other idolaters. It is almost certain that the Khazar power sheltered Jews, Muslims, Christians and pagans, and that synagogues, mosques and churches existed side by side in its cities. Ibn Hawqal, writing in 976-7 CE, confirmed this in his description of Samandar. There are Muslims living there, who have mosques in the place, and the Christians have churches and the Jews synagogues. Yaqut al-Hamawi, drawing on Ibn Fidlan, wrote, "The Muslims have in this city, Itil, a big mosque where they pray, and which they visit on Fridays. It had a tall minaret for summoning to prayer and several criers. When the king of the Khazars heard in the year 310, 922 CE, that Muslims had destroyed a synagogue in Dal al-Baybanaj, he ordered the minaret to be torn down, and this was done. And he put the criers to death. He said, if I did not fear that they would destroy all the synagogues in the Muslim lands, I would have destroyed this mosque." Jewish solidarity sometimes overcame the principle of religious tolerance, but did not do away with it, although when Jews were persecuted in the Byzantine Empire during the reign of the Emperor Romanus, King Joseph retaliated by persecuting Christian Khazars. Nevertheless, the Khagans implemented a policy similar to that of the Muslim kingdom of Al-Andalus, a mild monotheistic model, very different from the contemporary Christian civilization or from the totalitarian ethos of the Hasmonean kingdom. Muslims and Christians served in the Khagans' armies, and were even exempt from fighting when their fellow believers were on the other side. The Cambridge document supports the statement found in the letter of King Joseph, that the Khagans bore Hebrew names. King Joseph's letter mentions Hezekiah, Manasseh, Yitzhak, Zebulun, Menahem, Binyamin, and Aharon. The manuscript mentions kings named Binyamin and Aharon, which reinforces the correctness of the king's letter, albeit partially. The author of the manuscript also writes, "Now they say in our land that our ancestors came from the tribe of Simeon, but we are not able to prove the truth of the matter." Proselytes have always striven to find some direct genealogical link to the patriarchs of biblical mythology, and this tendency affected many of the Khazars, who wanted to believe that they were descended from the Israelite tribes. The religious consciousness grew more decisive in the next generation, and in time it overcame the former tribal identities associated with idolatry. The pagan cults became abominable in the eyes of the proud new monotheists, and even more so for their offspring and their imagined identity. The kingdom therefore saw itself as more Jewish than Khazar, and so it was documented in the contemporary Russian epics. It was not the land of the Khazars, but the land of the Jews, Zimlia Shyadovskaya, that awed its Slav neighbors. The desire for a sacred genealogy also gave rise to novel cultural markers. The list of kings in King Joseph's letter includes one named Honoka, and the Cambridge document mentions an army commander named Pesar. This original practice of naming people after religious festivals was unknown in biblical times or in the Hasmonean kingdom, nor has it been found in the kingdom of Himyar and its descendants, or among the Jews of distant North Africa. In later times, these names migrated westward to Russia, Poland and even Germany. Nevertheless, the question remains unanswered: did Jews constitute the majority of the monotheistic believers in the whole of Khazaria? The sources are contradictory. Some of the Arab writers assert that the Jewish Khazars were an elite minority that held the power. For example, Al-Istakri states that the smallest community are the Jews, while most of the inhabitants are Muslims and Christians, but the king and his courtiers are Jews. Others stated that all the Khazars were Jews. Yokit, following Ibn Fidlan, the most reliable source of the period, states, the Khazars and their king are all Jews. Al-Masudi likewise asserted, as for Jews, they are the king and his courtiers and his subjects the Khazars. It is quite possible that the bulk of the great Khazar tribe became Jews, while other tribes were only partly proselytized, and that many became Muslims or Christians or remained pagan. How big was the community of proselytized Khazars? The research has not come up with any figures. A major difficulty in history is that we never know much about the spiritual beliefs of the commonality. Most traditional Jewish historiography, as well as a major part of Soviet nationalist scholarship, emphasized that only the monarchy and the higher nobility became Jews, while the Khazar masses were pagan or adopted Islam. It must not be forgotten that in the 8th, 9th and 10th centuries CE, not all European peasants had become Christian, and that the faith was quite tenuous in the lower echelons of the medieval social hierarchy. On the other hand, it is known that at the time of the early monotheistic religions, slaves were almost always forced to adopt their master's faith. The wealthy Khazars, who owned many slaves, were no different, as the letter of King Joseph clearly states. Inscriptions engraved on many tombstones in the former Khazaria indicate widespread Judaism, though often with obvious syncretic deviations. The Khazar kingdom remained Jewish for too long, estimates range from 200 to 400 years, not to warrant the assumption that the practice and the faith trickled down to broader strata. Although it was probably not the pure and detailed halakhic Judaism, at least some of the commandments and rituals must have reached extensive congregations, otherwise, the Jewish religion would not have attracted so much attention, as well as a good deal of emulation, throughout the region. It is known that proselytization also took place among the Alans, speakers of Iranian dialects who lived under the Khazar aegis in the mountains of the northern Caucasus. The Cambridge document contains the statement that in one of the Khazars' many wars against their neighbors, only the king of the Alani was in support of Khazaria, for some of them observed the Torah of the Jews. It was the same with the great Khazar tribe, which pulled away from Khazaria and joined the Magyars on their westward migration. Before their migration to Central Europe, the Magyars, who are among the forebears of today's Hungarian people, were subordinated to the Khazar kingdom. The Khazars, who had been part of the Khazar population, rebelled against the Khagan for some reason, joined the Magyars, and left Khazaria with them. It is known that among them were a good many proselytes, and their presence in the formation of the Hungarian kingdom and the rise of the Jewish community in it may not be void of significance. In addition to the letter of King Joseph and the long Cambridge document, there is another Khazar document that was found in the Cairo Geniza, and brought to the same British university. Published only in 1962, it testifies to the spread of Judaism in the Slav regions of Khazaria. A letter in Hebrew sent from Kiev about 930 CE asks for assistance for a local Jew named Yaakov ben Honecker, who has lost all his property. The signatories on the letter are typical Hebrew names as well as Khazar Turkic ones, and together they claim to represent the congregation of Kiev. The letter also bears an endorsement in Turkish characters, saying, "I read it." This document almost certainly indicates the early presence of Khazar proselytes in the city that would soon become the Russian kingdom's first capital. It is even possible that the forebears of these Jews founded it, as the name Kiev derives from a Turkic dialect. There must have been a reason that a wide opening in the ancient city wall was known as the Jews' Gate, and that it led to a quarter known as Jewish and another called Khazar. Another early source attesting to the collective conversion of the Khazars is a Karaite one. In about 973 CE, one Yakov Kirkizani, a scholarly traveler who was quite familiar with the regions around Khazaria, wrote a commentary in Aramaic on the verse God shall enlarge Japheth, Genesis 9:27. This is what the words mean, he will dwell in the tents of Shem, which grant him a favor and advantage. And some commentators think that this refers to the Khazars, who became Jews. This Karaite testimony is not the only one confirming that the Judaization was not merely an Oriental fantasy of Arab scholars. In addition to Hasdai ibn Shaprut's request and the statements of Rabad, the great Rabbi Saadia Gaon, who lived in Baghdad for several years in the 10th century, also wrote about the Khazars. We saw in the previous chapter that he lamented the Islamization of Jews in the Holy Land. Did ye rejoice in the Judaization of a whole kingdom, by way of replacement? He may well have been dubious about these new Jews who showed up far north of Babylon, these believers in the law of Moses who were also tough warriors, riders of horses, periodic executioners of their own kings, and very active slave traders. The worry that these wild Jews did not accept the full burden of the Torah and all the precepts of the Talmud may well have dismayed the Karaite's severest ideological opponent. In his writings, he referred to the Judaization of the Khazars in a matter-of-fact way, mentioned the Kagan once, and also described a Jew named Yitzhak bar Abraham who journeyed to the Khazars' land and settled there. Later, sometime in the early 12th century, Rabbi Petahia of Regensburg, Ratisbon, set out to journey from his city in Germany to Baghdad. On the way, he passed through Kiev, the Crimean Peninsula, and other regions that had been parts of Khazaria, which had already declined and diminished. His impressions of the journey, actually written by his disciple, were as follows. In the land of Kedar and the land of Khazaria it is customary that the women mourn and bewail their deceased parents all day and all night. There are no Jews in Kedar, there are heretics, and Rabbi Petahia asked them, why do you not believe in the words of the sages? They replied, because our parents did not teach them. On the Sabbath eve they cut all the bread to be eaten on the Sabbath, and eat in the dark, and spend all day sitting in one place, and do not pray but sing the psalms. When Rabbi Petahia taught them our prayer and the blessing of food, they liked it, and said, we have not heard of the Talmud. This description strengthens the supposition that Karaism was widespread in the region or, alternatively, that there was an undefined Jewish syncretism in the steppes. Later, however, when Petahia reached Baghdad, he told a different story. The 7 kings of Meshech were visited by an angel, who told them in a dream to abandon their religions and laws and follow the law of Moses ben Amram, or their country would be destroyed. They tarried, until the angel began to devastate their land, and all the kings of Meshech and their people converted to Judaism, and asked the head of a seminary to send them Torah students, and poor students went there to teach them, and their sons the Torah and the Babylonian Talmud. Students went from Egypt to teach them. He saw the emissaries and those who went to the tomb of Ezekiel, heard about the miracles and that the worshippers' petitions were answered. Were these the last gasps of a dwindling Jewish kingdom? The desperate clinging to a faith that remained after the former royal glory? We know too little about the situation of Khazaria in the 12th century CE to venture an opinion. When did the great Khazar Empire collapse? In the past it was assumed by many that it happened in the second half of the 10th century. The Principality of Kiev, out of which grew the first Russian kingdom, was for many years a vassal of the rulers of Khazaria. The Principality grew stronger in the 10th century, struck an alliance with the Eastern Roman Empire and attacked its powerful Khazar neighbors. In 965, or 969, Sviatoslav I, the ruling prince of Kiev, attacked the Khazar city of Sarkel, which controlled the Don River, and captured it. Sarkel was a fortified city, originally built by Byzantine engineers, of important strategic value to the Jewish Empire, and its loss marked the beginning of the empire's decline. Contrary to prevalent opinion, however, this was not the end of Khazaria. Reports about the fate of the capital Itil in this war are contradictory. Some Arab sources state that it fell, others state that it survived the Russian victory. Since it consisted largely of huts and tents, it may well have been rebuilt. What is certain, though, is that in the second half of the 10th century Khazaria lost its hegemonic position in the region. Prince Vladimir I of Kiev, Sviatoslav's young son, expanded the boundaries of his principality as far as the Crimea, and, in a significant step for the future of Russia, converted to Christianity. His alliance with the Eastern Roman Empire undermined its long connection with Khazaria, and in 1016 a joint Byzantine-Russian force attacked and defeated the Jewish kingdom. Thereafter, the Russian Church was headed by the Patriarch of Constantinople, but this holy alliance did not last long. In 1071 the Seljuks, rising tribes of Turkic origin, defeated the empire's considerable forces, and eventually the Kievan Russian kingdom, too, fell apart. Little is known about the situation of Khazaria in the late 11th century CE. There are some mentions of Khazar warriors fighting in the armies of other powers, but there is almost no information about the kingdom itself. Seljuk assaults on the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, beginning at about the same time, ended its flourishing intellectual renaissance, and most Arab chronicles fell silent for a long time. Empires have risen and fallen throughout history, but the monotheistic religions, as noted in the first chapter, were far more durable and stable. From the decline of the tribal societies until modern times, religious identity meant far more to people than did their superficial relationship to empires, kingdoms or principalities. In the course of its triumphant history, Christianity outlived many political regimes, and so did Islam. Why, then, not Judaism? It survived the fall of the Hasmonean kingdom, the collapse of Odia Bene and Himyar and Dihya al-Kahina's heroic defeat. It also survived the last Jewish empire, which stretched from the Caspian to the Black Sea. The decline of Khazaria's political power did not cause the collapse of Judaism in its main cities, or in extensions of it that reached deep into the Slav territories. The continued Jewish presence in them is documented. The fact that Jews held on to their faith in the mountains, in the steppes, in the river valleys and in the Crimean Peninsula is attested not only by Petahia. Christian testimonies, too, reveal that followers of the law of Moses existed in various places. But if the internecine wars in the sprawling prairies between the Caspian Sea, the Black Sea and the Caucasus Mountains did not annihilate populations and religions, the torrential Mongolian invasion, led by Genghis Khan and his sons in the early 13th century, swept up everything in its path and wrecked the political, cultural and even economic morphologies of all of Western Asia and Eastern Europe. Some new kingdoms arose under the aegis of the Golden Horde, apparently including a small Khazar kingdom, but the Mongols did not understand the needs of land cultivation in the vast territories they captured, and did not sufficiently care for the farming needs of the subjugated populations. During the conquest, the irrigation systems that branched from the wide rivers, systems that had sustained the cultivation of rice and vineyards, were demolished, causing the flight of masses of people and depopulating the prairies for hundreds of years. Among the emigrants were many Jewish Khazars who, together with their neighbors, advanced into the western Ukraine and hence to Polish and Lithuanian territories. Only the Khazars in the mountains of the Caucasus managed, to some extent, to hold on to their land, where agriculture was based mainly on precipitation. After the first half of the 13th century, there are no more mentions of Khazaria, the kingdom sank into historical oblivion.